This week on Act Out, Indigenous lands become a testing ground for Israeli-U.S. mass surveillance. And once again, Indigenous wisdom throws common sense at the blundering idiocy of empire. Plus, kids are pre-existing conditions now, and detention centers are black sites. Next up, the people are mobilizing and connecting issues and power in the face of imperialist climate change. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So back in episode 176, we covered the exchange program between Israeli forces and our police, known as the Deadly Exchange. And now it appears that we're ramping up that deadly exchange to include a $26 million contract with the U.S. division of Elbit Systems, Israel's largest military company. For what, you ask? Well, for what amounts to the most localized, intrusive, and most expansive surveillance network yet seen in the United States. In an almost embarrassingly cliche show, the target is a Native American reservation. The Tohono O'odham Nation, as recognized by the United States, sits right along the border with Mexico in Arizona, right between Phoenix and Tucson. Of course, the actual traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham expand well beyond that border, with some 175 miles of their ancestral lands in what is now called Mexico. There are many Tohono O'odham peoples who live in Mexico, and as an already splintered tribe and as protectors of the land since time immemorial, the tribe has been very vocal about the expanded militarization of the border region. Perhaps most notably, the border wall, criticizing its blunt and very ill-conceived barrier for not only tribal members, but for nature, from water supply to animals who frequently pass back and forth. It's really funny how they never seem to need any immigration papers. In an interview in 2017, then tribal vice chairman Verlan Jose explained how the Tohono O'odham had many meetings with Border Patrol in order to implement solutions that would provide a vehicle barrier along the border while still allowing the free movement of animals, and why that's so important. "We do not own the land, but we care for the land," he said. "Every stick and stone is sacred. Every creature is sacred." Tohono O'odham rancher Jacob Sarapo echoed this point by explaining the clash between border protection and natural law. For example, he has to travel into Mexico in order to fill water barrels for both domestic and agricultural use, because that's where the water is. He finishes the interview by shaking his head and saying, "Wall. There is no O'odham word for wall." But there is an English word for wall, and English words for mass fucking surveillance. This latest assault on the Tohono O'odham Nation would include a 160-foot surveillance tower, capable of continuously monitoring every person and vehicle within a radius of up to 7.5 miles. The tower will be outfitted with high-definition cameras with night vision, thermal sensors, and ground-sweeping radar, all of which will feed real-time data to Border Patrol agents at a central operating station in Ajo, Arizona. The system will store an archive with the ability to rewind and track individuals' movements across time, an ability known as wide-area persistent surveillance. Oh, I'm sorry, did I say a tower? I meant 10. 10 towers are scheduled to be constructed across the reservation. And it's really not like there wasn't any goddamn surveillance there to begin with. Since the mid-2000s, this post-9/11 war on terror has occupied Tohono O'odham lands in ever-mirrored versions of Palestine. Residents say agents have administered beatings, used pepper spray, pulled people out of vehicles, shot 2 Tohono O'odham men under suspicious circumstances, and entered people's homes without warrants. "It is apartheid here," Ophile Rivas says. "We have to carry our papers everywhere. And everyone here has experienced the Border Patrol's abuse in some way." So I know I sound like a broken record sometimes, but here it is again. Colonialism never ended. It just found new toys. from Palestine to the indigenous lands of what's now known as Arizona. And just like the deadly exchange, these tools are not reserved for Palestinians, indigenous, or black and brown folks. That's just the testing lab for this horror show. Indeed, according to Bobby Brown, Senior Director of Customs and Border Protection at Elbit Systems of America, the company's ultimate goal is to build a layer of electronic surveillance equipment across the entire perimeter of the U.S. Over time, we'll expand not only to the northern border, but to the ports and harbors across the country, Brown said in an interview with The Intercept. There's a lot to be done. And I might just go ahead and remind viewers and listeners that 2/3 of U.S. residents already live in what's known as the Constitution-Free Zone, an area 100 miles inland from every land and water border in the U.S., where the Constitution is essentially null and void in order to facilitate authoritarian border policing. Add to that these thermal and night vision towers, and I mean, wow, not even Orwell could have seen this coming. And yet, the sad irony of all of this is that the flow of migrants won't stop. People will not stop desperately trying to survive, even if that means walking into 1984. You cannot crush someone's home, their lives, and expect them not to leave. Right now, their choices are between countries ripped apart by U.S. imperialism, rape, murder, torture, and the host virus, the U.S. Grueling, underpaid, or even slave labor if you're lucky, abominable concentration camps if you're not. Concentration camps that could soon essentially act as black sites, away from any public oversight. Last week, the Trump administration announced its plans to scrap the Flores settlement, which governs the care of migrant children. As part of a sweeping proposal to scrap the Flores regulations, including a change that would enable the Trump administration to detain migrant children in secure facilities indefinitely, the administration will lose the existing monitoring requirements entirely, according to 2 lawyers familiar with this area of law. Meaning, basically, the information that we've gotten from lawyers and advocates, mostly not journalists, who visit these camps and then desperately pass information to the public and flippant corporate media, that would end. And kids inside could disappear just as easily as an uncharged teenager in Gitmo. And while outlets like the Huffington Post seem to think that this eventuality is unlikely because, we just don't have the capacity to cage that many kids, I find it highly risky to place your hope in whether or not the prison industrial complex can expand in order to accommodate more bodies. Because, that's literally all they do. Meanwhile, if the black sites don't get you, maybe that incurable disease you have will. Because also last week, the Trump administration announced that they would end a deferred action program for migrant children in the United States who are receiving treatment for life-threatening illnesses. Immigrants living and receiving medical care in Massachusetts, for instance, learned of the Trump administration's policy change when they received letters from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services earlier this month, warning them that they will be deported if they don't leave the country in 33 days. Kids with cancer, cystic fibrosis, HIV, and other illnesses, fuck off. Go back to the countries we have decimated, in many cases withheld life-saving medicine from. Go back there. Because this is America. And in America, we do not take care of migrants. We don't even take care of our own residents. We only take care of that same sliver of humanity that we looked out for when this country first ungraciously belched forth from British rule into existence. White, property-owning men. The white male top of the economic political chain. That's it. That's always been it. Sure, now we let some women in, let some color in there so it looks good in pictures. But we are that very same nation. The colonialist, imperialist, racist, genocidal nation. And the more that we hold on to some sort of fairy tale idea of the land of the free, the longer we will be totally blind to the reality that is unfolding right in front of us. The surveillance towers, the kids in cages and black sites, the dead and dying that we built and continue to build an empire upon. It's a harsh and unbelievably shitty reality to accept, but it is ours, and we have to own it in order to change it. Speaking of empire and rattling thrones, activists are working to draw connections between our military-industrial complex and issues often seen as separate: migration, climate change, indigenous rights, and more. And by making these connections, we not only step outside of our divided silos, but in so doing, we become stronger. Here to talk more about a people's mobilization to stop the war machine and stop climate chaos is Margaret Flowers, co-director of Popular Resistance and organizer with the People's Mobilization. Take a look.
Okay, so the People's Mobilization covers a wide spectrum of issues related to the military-industrial complex. Let's start with the climate issue. Talk about that connection and the importance of highlighting the U.S. empire in the People's Climate Mobilization on September 20th.
Right. I think we're at a point now where it's really critical to build connections between the climate movement and the anti-war peace movement. For one thing, I look at, two of the biggest threats that we're facing are the climate crisis and the possibility of a global war that could be a nuclear war. And either one of those are going to be a disastrous outcome. And I think that the anti-war movement needs to start looking at what the climate movement is doing in terms of being very mobilized and confrontational, and start to use those tactics as well, because we're facing, on a number of fronts, the possibility of a conflict. So, and then, from the climate perspective, of course, we know that the U.S. military is the largest single user of fossil fuels, the largest single contributor of greenhouse gases. Of course, we also pollute and destroy, ecosystems, precious ecosystems with our military. And a lot of our wars are, of course, for oil. The military benefits the oil industry. We protect the waterways for them so they can move their oil tankers through. So there's a lot of connections. And we're very excited that the climate movement folks that we've reached out to are very receptive to that and, welcoming of us bringing that message, to them and them bringing their message to us.
So, with regards to that, one of the critiques of Extinction Rebellion is that it's appealing to authority, that it's engaging in civil disobedience with regards to asking governments and media to change, as opposed to direct action vis-a-vis, blocking a pipeline or something like that. What would be your take on that critique?
Well, I think that in the social movements, we have a number of different targets, and there are folks that are doing very good work trying to shut down pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure. There are folks that are trying to build, positive alternatives of renewable energy. There are people that are trying to appeal to the power structure as well and put the power on them. They shouldn't be, or put the pressure on them. They shouldn't be, ignored. They have the capability to declare a climate emergency, which is what we need, and to take steps, and we can't let them off the hook by not focusing on them at all. I think that the Extinction Rebellion, and there are lots of different climate organizations that are doing good work, has really been doing a good job of drawing folks in, being very creative, and getting a clear message out, and I think we should appreciate the fact that they're doing that.
So moving on to another part of the People's Mobilization, September 21st, focusing on the Puerto Rican Independence March. Talk a little bit about why you felt that it was important to be a part of that.
Well, the folks that have been organizing that march have been working on it for over a year now, and specifically to do an action that goes to the United Nations on at a time when the UN General Assembly is there. It's also the International Day of Peace. And we had initially thought about holding our march and rally on that day, but when we learned that they were doing this, we just felt that it would be more important for us to be supportive of that. And nobody knew at the time that we were going to be in this very interesting time where Puerto Ricans are rising up and have actually thrown out their governors and are, starting to have these conversations about decolonization, which is really essential. And that's so in line with our message and our demands that really, we need to decolonize. We need to stop, the illegal actions that the United States has been taking and continues to take.
And I want to jump on something that you just said here, because it's something that I talk about on the show a lot too. It's the idea of connecting issues, and that, we do a great job of very much focusing on our silos and in our niches and not and kind of severing the ties that exist naturally, of course, because we all exist under the same system. Talk a little bit about how you you mentioned that you saw that they were doing this march, and so you kind of like restructured so that you could support as opposed to trying to make something on top of it. Talk a little bit about how you'd suggest that other folks go about doing that and finding those connections as opposed to staying in the niche.
Yeah, it's really critical that we find those connections. There's a lot of writing that's been done about how kind of the nonprofit industrial complex has financed people into these silos where we're all working in our little areas, and that's not really how movements are. Movements are broad, they're large, they're diverse, they're people who are impacted by in all different ways by the system that we live under. And we have we're disempowered when we go off into our little silos and just stay on our single little message. When we come together and recognize that literally all of our struggles are connected, when we're fighting for protecting the planet, human rights, anti-militarism, economic justice, all racial justice, these are all deeply connected. And when we come together, we are much more powerful and effective in what we're doing.
And so you'd mentioned the UN. I want to talk about the UN Charter because that's the focus of events happening on Monday, the 23rd. Why use the UN Charter as a baseline for the discussion about demilitarization?
This is one piece of it. And we have been talking throughout this year about the need to, there's so many countries that are impacted by the United States illegal measures, unilateral coercive measures that we call sanctions, but they're not actually technically sanctions. They're technically violations of the United Nations Charter because the U.S. is just unilaterally imposing them on other countries. And not just, we're not just putting sanctions on Venezuela and Iran and Russia, but we're also sanctioning the countries that do business with those countries, which all of this is completely illegal. And so we started talking about, well, how do we build this kind of civil society component to be raising awareness about the impacts of these illegal acts and taking measures to provide some sort of relief to folks that are impacted by them, and pressing on the international community to hold the United States accountable. And what we found was that there's kind of been a parallel effort going on at the state level where countries like Iran and Venezuela are working together through the Nonaligned movement to bring more and more countries around the world to join together and start to try to hold the United States accountable. And they found that using the language of the United Nations Charter was something that worked in that arena. And so we wanted to provide some sort of a civil society component that supported that, because the United Nations, we're all aware, has been really taken over by big interests, but dominated by the United States. There are corporate interests there. That's why we haven't gotten a decent climate agreement out of them. The United Nations is not functioning the way that it was founded to function. And so it either needs to be pressured to do that, or there is this non-aligned movement of 120 countries that have now come together multiple times, but most recently in Venezuela this year, and put out a declaration saying that they literally want the law to be respected, sovereignty of countries to be respected, to use international law to resolve disputes, and to take real action to protect the planet. And so I think we need to be supporting that.
And I guess one of the problems is also the UN doesn't have any actual power to do it. Every time that there's a vote about the Cuba blockade, for instance, basically everybody except for us in Israel are like, yeah, lift it. It's ridiculous. But because, right. But because there's actually no power behind that, it's kind of performative in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and the International Court of Justice, which is its legal body, does make decisions, but I'm not sure how able it is to enforce those decisions. I just think it's a way of building this international solidarity and starting to raise awareness that the United States is acting in real criminal ways and shouldn't be allowed to get away with this any longer. And so that's this is a mechanism for us to make that argument. Whether it's going to be successful or not, I can't say, but I think it has to be a first step of pointing out that, we're trying to use the bodies that exist And if they're not working, then we need to be doing something differently.
And with regards to something different, it was recently the G7, and a lot of people are saying that the U.S. was really kind of an outsider, not least of all because Macron just invited Iran to partake. And I'm no fan of Macron, but I do feel that the entire world should take a page out of his book and really point out that the U.S. is an outsider, and that if the rest of the world were to unite against the US, both in terms of economic force and political force, it would make a huge difference. Do you see that recent events as kind of a shift towards that? Are you hopeful in that sense?
We're definitely starting to see signs of that. And analysts like Alfred McCoy are saying that the United States empire is basically going to be gone by 2030. So the next decade is going to be a really interesting time, and we're already seeing how the global dynamics, power dynamics are shifting. And there's been such a long history of the United States really dominating all of the international institutions. Countries, they still do it. A lot of the European countries and our right-wing allies in Latin America, siding with the U.S. and cowing to the U.S. basically, and all sorts of areas. But we are seeing cracks in that now. And you see it with, the situation with Venezuela, when the United States, when President Trump on August 5th signed an embargo, a blockade of Venezuela, literally trying to keep them from getting food and medications. Russia and China just said, hey, we're going to sign a big deal with Venezuela to build more oil refineries, which I'm not a fan of, but right now that's what Venezuela depends on. And we're going to continue to bring deliveries to them, shipments to them. So we're also seeing kind of countries working together to trade outside of the U.S. dollar because of the way that the U.S. manipulates that. And so I think that we are really starting to see this interesting time where, and I think it's going to escalate more. I think as more countries stand up to the United States, they'll gain more confidence in doing that.
And in that same vein, I mean, we already talked about the connection between movements, but there's also the connection across borders because, of course, global capitalism and the economy doesn't care about borders, so our movements shouldn't either. With regards to the people's mobilization, how are you dealing with that aspect of it, like the cross-border connection?
Right. Well, I agree with you absolutely. As people, and this is why we did the peace delegations to Iran early this year, to Venezuela, that it's really important for us to reach across the borders and organize and network person to person, because we can also have a stronger impact by doing that. I think in the United States, we have a really big responsibility because our country is such a bad actor to really support movements in other countries and build connections with them. And so as part of the event that we're doing on Monday night, we've invited representatives of various countries to come and speak to us about what they're experiencing. And then we're also going to be having civil society groups from the United States talking about the work that they're doing and strategizing about how we can plug in and amplify that. And then I also wanted to just raise that as part of this, we have this new thing called the Global Appeal for Peace. And it's people can check that out at Global Appeal, the number 4 peace.net. And it's a first step towards building this kind of international network of people who want to hold the United States accountable, who want to use peaceful means and laws to resolve conflicts. And so we're going to be doing something around that as well during the People's Mobilization.
And finally, this is something that I know pretty much every activist grapples with, but and I know that's something that you do a lot as well as local activism. And the military-industrial complex is a hell of a beast to go after, and even though it operates on the local level, it's obviously like a federal entity. And I wanted you to talk about the pitfalls of this work and a legitimate path forwards with regards to combating something this huge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and there have been successful efforts in the past to combat something this huge. I mean, there was a tremendous movement during the Vietnam War. And it's interesting, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the People's Mobilization. against the war in Vietnam, where hundreds of thousands of people came to the Pentagon and protested. Look at, in 2014, when President Obama wanted to outright just openly bomb Syria, people rose up, and Congress was flooded with phone calls. There were protests, and he had to find another way to intervene in Syria. This is not, we have these little victories. We never actually win the whole thing, but we have had some of these smaller victories. And I think that that if we can change public opinion about these issues and start to make these connections between, and I think it's happening. You're seeing more and more people talking about the Pentagon budget and why are they getting more and more money every year, almost 2/3 of our federal discretionary spending now, while we're having cuts to healthcare, to food programs, to education. And so I think, we're starting to raise this awareness and shifting public opinion, and that's really a first step.
And of course, the power of converging movements, converging the climate movement, which, as you noted, continues to gain steam, and then adding anti-war and anti-military industrial complex efforts to that is potentially huge.
Yeah, and the climate movement is building connections with the immigrants' rights movement. And of course, this is all connected. War, climate, migration are all connected very deeply. And that's a very powerful movement right there, if you bring those three together.
To learn more and to sign up to be a part of the People's Mobilization, visit peoplesmob.org. Global Appeal for, the number 4, peace.net is another site that Margaret mentioned, so be sure to check that out as well. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Reminder, before you click off here, please sign up for our newsletter. It is the best way to stay up to date on all of our work and sidestep social media censorship. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch. We got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since your push to serve my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I will kill for